thousands of years before any European ship touched this coastline. A vast network of civilizations already stretched from the Pacific to the Atlantic. They built governments, trade empires, and cities of cedar and stone. And most of what you learned in school about this land, about its people, about the thousands of years before contact, barely scratched the surface. The real story is far more extraordinary.
So who were the people who shaped this entire continent for over 10,000 years, who built nations, mastered agriculture, and engineered democracy centuries before Europe even considered it?
But here is what no one talks about. Before the flags, before the borders, before the word Canada even existed, entire civilizations rose, thrived, and governed themselves across this land for over 10,000 years. This is the story that came before everything you were taught. Thousands of years of innovation, governance, art, and survival, written not in books, but into the living land itself. And it starts with ice.
Let's rewind way back. Around 12,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, the last ice age was loosening its grip on the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were lower, and the world looked nothing like today. Between Siberia and Alaska, a wide strip of exposed land connected Asia to North America. Researchers call it Beringia, and it would change the course of human history on this continent forever.
Small groups of people crossed this bridge, not in one dramatic march, but slowly, over generations, following herds of mammoth, caribou, and bison across a landscape most of us can barely imagine.
These were not lost wanderers. They were skilled navigators, reading ice, wind, and animal behavior with precision that modern science is only now beginning to understand.
They shared the land with giants, woolly mammoths, ancient bison, saber-toothed predators. This was a world that no longer exists, erased by warming temperatures and rising seas over millennia.
Recent discoveries, ancient footprints in New Mexico, coastal sites in British Columbia, suggest humans may have arrived even earlier than we thought, some traveling by boat down the Pacific coast. Thousands of years before the inland ice corridor even opened, people were already here, fishing, hunting, building communities along the coastline. The old timeline was wrong. By roughly 10,000 years ago, every major region of what we now call Canada was home to thriving human communities, and they were anything but simple. Every tool, every technique, every piece of knowledge was refined across hundreds of generations. Nothing about these civilizations was primitive. Nothing was accidental.
Here's something most people don't realize. When we say Indigenous peoples of Canada, we're not talking about one culture. We're talking about dozens of distinct nations.
They spoke over 70 different languages across 12 entirely separate language families. To put that in perspective, that is more linguistic diversity than all of Europe.
On the west coast, the Haida, Tlingit, and Nuu-chah-nulth built massive cedar longhouses. These weren't temporary shelters. They were permanent monuments, engineered to last generations.
They carved towering monumental poles that told the stories of entire lineages. Every figure, every animal, every symbol carried meaning. History recorded not in books, but in wood.
And they held elaborate potlatch ceremonies, massive gatherings where leaders gave away enormous amounts of wealth, not to show greed, but to show generosity.
Status was measured not by what you hoarded, but by what you could afford to give away. Wealth meant nothing unless it flowed outward. Power came through generosity.
Every mask told a story. Every ceremony reinforced bonds between families, clans, and nations. This was culture operating at the highest level of complexity and meaning. On the Great Plains, nations like the Blackfoot, Cree, and Nakota followed the buffalo and seasonal cycles that required extraordinary coordination and ecological knowledge.
They used buffalo jumps, carefully chosen cliff edges where entire herds were driven to their deaths. It sounds brutal, but it was brilliant, and it required extraordinary planning. Weeks of preparation, scouting, building drive lanes of stone cairns, coordinating dozens of people across kilometers of open prairie. This was not primitive hunting. This was organized strategy.
The buffalo provided everything: meat for food, hide for shelter and clothing, bone for tools, sinew for thread. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted.
In the Arctic, the Inuit engineered survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth, temperatures dropping to -50, months of total darkness. And yet, they thrived. Their innovations weren't primitive. The igloo's thermal design trapped warm air inside, while cold air sank and drained away through the entrance tunnel. This was brilliant engineering. Snow goggles, the kayak, toggling harpoon heads. Every single tool was a solution, born from centuries of careful observation, testing, and adaptation to the most extreme conditions on the planet.
A hunter could wait motionless at a seal breathing hole for hours in -40 temperatures. That level of discipline, knowledge, and physical endurance is almost beyond modern comprehension.
Now, if you think democracy was invented in ancient Greece and then handed to the modern world, you might want to sit down for this next part. Centuries before European contact, possibly as early as the 1100s, 5 Haudenosaunee nations formed one of the most sophisticated political alliances in human history. The Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca came together under what is known as the Great Law of Peace. This wasn't a loose agreement. It was a detailed constitution. Passed down orally and recorded in wampum belts, it established representative councils. It separated powers between war chiefs and peace chiefs. Each decision required consensus. It gave clan mothers the authority to appoint and remove leaders. Think about that. Women held the power to select and dismiss chiefs in the 1100s. Some historians argue the Haudenosaunee Confederacy directly influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. Whether you accept that connection or not, one thing is undeniable. This was advanced, structured governance with checks, balances, and women's rights, operating on this continent long before any European parliament existed, centuries before.
And these nations didn't exist in isolation. A massive continental trade network connected communities across thousands of kilometers. The scale of it is staggering.
Obsidian from the Rockies, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. These goods moved along river systems and overland trails, a web of exchange operating for millennia.
In the eastern woodlands, nations like the Wendat practiced large-scale agriculture, not small gardens, organized farms that fed thousands of people across permanent settlements. They grew corn, beans, and squash, a trio so nutritionally complete that indigenous farmers called them the Three Sisters. And they weren't planted randomly. They were planted together. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil. The corn provided a structure for the beans to climb. The squash shaded the ground and kept moisture in, each plant supporting the others.
This wasn't random planting. This was sophisticated agricultural science, companion planting refined over hundreds, maybe thousands, of careful observation and experimentation. These weren't scattered subsistence gardens. These were large-scale, organized food production systems that sustained permanent communities of thousands. This was civilization. Full stop. So when the first European explorers arrived on these shores, Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, Samuel de Champlain in the early 1600s, they did not stumble onto an empty wilderness. They entered a world that was already fully inhabited, politically organized, culturally rich, technologically adapted to its environment in ways that Europeans often failed to understand or chose to ignore. Because acknowledging what was already here would have made what came next
much harder to justify.
The myth of the empty land, terra nullius, was never true. It was a story told to justify what came next, a convenient lie drawn on paper and repeated until it became accepted as fact. But the reality was always there, written into the land, into the languages, and into the living memory of the people who had shaped this continent for over 10,000 years.
And that history didn't end with contact. It didn't disappear. It wasn't erased. The people, the knowledge, the cultures, they continue. Right now. Right here.
If this changed how you see the land beneath your feet, subscribe. We go deep on the histories that don't make it into textbooks. Next up, what happened when these worlds collided?